Your Eminence Cardinal George Pell, it's great to be back with you again.
Likewise, Colm, very pleased to be here.
Reading your second volume of Prison Diaries, I was struck by the amount of letters you received from all over the world, sometimes 70 or 80 letters a week. Who was writing to you?
Sometimes 70 or 80 letters a day at different stages, but obviously. I received all up about 4,000 letters. Every type of person, most of them believers, not all of them. Most of them Catholics, but not all of them.
And the non-believers who were writing to you, what was their interest in the case or in your story?
Generally, the non-believers who wrote were outraged by the injustice that they saw in the story. One regular recounted how this person wasn't an unbeliever, but you hadn't been going to Mass. And they were so outraged by what they read that they raced into a Catholic workmate and explained that they decided to go back to Mass for some perverse reason. But I was quite pleased about that, because one of my concerns was the effect of my conviction on Catholics on the edge or people who were wobbling.
You were concerned that it might turn them
Tip
away
them
from
over,
the faith?
turn them away from the faith.
Or bring them back in closer
Well, in
to
fact,
it.
I heard more about people coming back to the faith than I heard about people who were leaving. But I suppose if those who were leaving might have chosen not to write to me.
To tell you. And a lot of prisoners writing to you also?
Quite a few. One fellow asked for advice on how he should deal with his teenage son. And I said, well, that's a little bit difficult. I don't know you or your son, but I said a few words, and I think he followed the line, and I don't think it was disastrous.
Is it true, Your Eminence, that some of the letters were withheld from you because they were hate mail? And I even read in the diary that someone had said to you that some of the letters were withheld if they had photographs with children in them as well.
I think you were supposed to be told if they withheld any letters. I had received 2 or 3 hostile letters. I wasn't told about any others that came in. I did hear about letters where the photographs had been removed, because if you're convicted of pedophilia, you are not supposed to be exposed to photos of children. It was a bit of a mess, because I was told that material had been sent to me and had never arrived. I'd heard it was sent twice and hadn't arrived, so I commenced dialogue about it. And one friendly guard brought up a whole plastic basket of mail which had never been delivered to me, which I went through, and of course there were quite a few photos and letters and all these things. But some of the photos were, which contained the photos of children, were withheld. But if you're convicted of pedophilia, they're the conditions. Mm-hmm. And there was no way around it. Of course I didn't like it.
What was your relationship like with the prison guards?
That was probably the biggest surprise of the jail.
Do you think you got some sort of special treatment because you were the famous Cardinal George Pell and so high profile in the media?
I don't think so. I think some of them went out of their way to ensure that wasn't the case. All of them, even the ones that were a bit hostile, were correct, and most of them were very human.
The diaries are a remarkable insight into prison life. The simple things that we take for granted, of course. For example, one day the prison warden allowed you to play with the basketball when it was only permitted on a Sunday, or you were allowed to water the plants in the garden. What were the little pleasures that you enjoyed when in prison?
Oh, there were very simple things like that. Food that I liked.
Could you request a certain type of food?
Yes, that was another thing that surprised me. You'd get a menu listing 3 or 4 options for every main meal during the week. Now, I think that was probably a necessity because of the different racial backgrounds of us prisoners. An especially sad group were the drug mules. Often they didn't speak English. Here in Australia, they'd come in from overseas with drugs, caught, imprisoned, and had no one to visit them at all. So they were entirely dependent on the volunteer helpers and the chaplains.
And they wouldn't have the know-how or the resources that, let's say, you had to put together an appeal.
Oh, no, well, I mean, I was blessed in a number of ways, in a very unfortunate situation. First of all, the charges, I was able to refute them. Now, you could be spectacularly unlucky and get charges fabricated against you, which were very difficult to disprove. The other thing was that I had a lot of extremely loyal friends. My family was completely loyal. People who were very capable. I had access to a wonderful legal team, but I had access to friends who were very good lawyers. And also I had a lot of people with considerable money kicked in to help pay my expenses. So I had all sorts of advantages that are not available to most people, and I acknowledge that.
That was another fascinating part of the diaries, just the whole process of you formulating your appeal to the High Court and it going from you to your legal team, them sending the drafts back to you, you trying to decide whether you should ask for bail or not. And what struck me was the mounting costs that must have just been rising and rising. Was that something you were concerned about? Because another part of the diary, you said that I think your legal team had applied for $800,000 to have your legal expenses covered by the state of Victoria, and they allocated $390,000. And you said, while it wasn't what you wanted, it was better than a kick in the pants.
Yeah, well, it certainly was, and I'm grateful for that. My first parish priest said I was the sort of person who never worried about money as long as it was coming in. Now, I knew the debts were very considerable. They ran probably 3 million plus. There's still a significant amount that remains to be paid, but I wasn't particularly worried about it. I was disconcerted, but I wasn't, and I'm not particularly worried about it.
We spoke about
I'm very grateful to all the people who kicked in, and sometimes very, very generously, and many, many ordinary battlers put in money to the Defence Fund too, and I'm very grateful for that.
But that's something you're still working on now.
Yes, that story's not over.
We talked about your relationship with the prison guards, and I know that you didn't have much interaction with the other prisoners because you were in isolation, but you could certainly hear them at points. What was that sound like? Was it at night time when you were trying to sleep? You write bits about the banging, hearing prisoners shout that they wanted to go home, others yelling back at them to shut up.
It was very sad. Sometimes the people were so angry. Sometimes they were so full of anguish. Sometimes it was pathetic and childish. I heard one night I couldn't catch all of it, a prolonged debate between two of them over whether I was really guilty, which was interesting.
Were you shouting, chiming in as well?
No, I just let them go.
Another incident that wasn't so pleasant, you were walking down the corridor in the prison from your cell to the exercise pen, and for some reason there was a gate open or something, but a prisoner spat at you and it landed on you.
No, it wasn't quite like that. I was actually in the exercise cell, and there was an area which was never opened for me on any other occasion and had been left open inadvertently. And so I was walking around, actually I just happened to be saying the rosary, and suddenly I was spat on, or attempt to spit on. So I was furious and turned and went to the grill to rebuke whoever it was, and to my slight amazement, he promptly fled. Now, I mean, we were separated completely by a terrible grill, but he continued to abuse me.
He was calling you a rock spider.
Yes, I'm not sure that I got the correct term. I might have called it a black spider or a rock spider, but it's a term of abuse for pedophiles.
Was that the first time you got very angry in prison?
Yes, I think it is. I snapped at one guard when he asked me whether I was thinking of suiciding, so I bit his head off and explained to him succinctly that I was a Christian, and we didn't go in for that. But apart from, that's the only time I think I lost. I didn't lose my temper, but I was very cross.
Germany. Let's talk for a moment about Germany, because in the diaries you do talk a bit about the situation of the church in Germany. You were watching it closely. What do you think about how things are unfolding at the moment in the Catholic Church in Germany?
Well, I think it's ominous. There are two basic positions. In one of those, for what I call gospel Christians, the last word comes from the scriptures, as interpreted in our case by the church. In an alternative Christian point of view, the last word comes from modern understandings of the scriptures. I think there's a percentage of the German church which seems to be resolutely heading in the wrong direction. And by that I mean it's quite clear that a liberalised Christianity, whether it's a liberalised Catholicism or Protestantism, in a generation or so merges into agnosticism. Of course, the duty of the German bishops is to uphold the teachings of Scripture, to uphold the teachings of the Church. We stand under those teachings. They've got no power to change them. None of us do. What is important is what is in the Word of God, what is in the apostolic tradition. And I don't think when push comes to a shove they'll, to mix my metaphors, cross the Rubicon. But we'll see. We'll see. You never know.
You write again about the Vatican financial scandals in this second volume of your diaries. Are those criminal elements that you spoke about in your diary, do you think they've all dissipated? Have they disappeared from the Vatican Bank?
Actually, I think they might be completely gone from the Vatican Bank. Certainly the leadership there is good. Whether they're entirely gone from the rest of the Vatican is a different question. I don't know. Somebody said it's like mowing a lawn. You mow the lawn, but sometimes you're not quite sure what's the character of the root that remains below the surface. And when the spring comes again, they might return. So I just don't know, but certainly a lot of the trouble has been removed.
I used to say that we don't know how many souls are lost in hell or how many enter heaven, but with money you know what you lose and what you gain. It is close to impossible to conceal the worst, and you fear for the financial future. Chickens come home to roost, and a poor or bankrupt church can do nothing material to help the poor. Do you fear sometimes that the church might be heading for financial ruin?
No, I don't. I think we can avoid that. But one of the good things we did bring in was clear accounting procedures. One of the fascinating and disconcerting realities when we started the financial reforms was that it was almost impossible for most people to know where the Vatican really was financially. Now that's changed with proper accounting methods. I think we now have access to accurate information. I've often quoted the fact we found 1.4 billions worth of euros in the Vatican which weren't on the books. Now, I don't think we're going to go bankrupt at all. For one thing, there's not an enormous debt. It's quite a strange situation.
You described it in your book as foggy and muddled.
Yes, it's much less muddled than it was. It's less foggy than it was. But the weather's not good.
Finally, Your Eminence, in another part of the diaries, I read you writing that you had an ambition to live long enough to speak at the next pre-conclave meeting, so you could talk about the kind of Pope you think the Church needs.
That was probably a little bit indiscreet to write that.
Well, now I'd like to ask you about it. At that meeting, let's look to the future. What would you say, or what would you speak about?
Well, I'd just go back to the scriptural teaching on the role of Peter. The Pope is the successor of Peter. He's the rock man, the foundation of the church. He's there to strengthen the faith of his brothers and sisters. The Pope is the cornerstone for universal church unity. The Church of Rome traditionally has been the final arbiter on what belongs genuinely to the apostolic tradition, what is compatible with the teachings of Christ and the apostles. The doctrinal role of the papacy is absolutely fundamental.
What age are you today, Your Eminence?
I'm 79.
79.
And very soon to turn 80 when you lose your vote.
How do you feel about turning 80, and how do you feel about losing your vote?
Well, I've always said that I agreed with the principle that you lose your vote at 80. Now, some people are saying with modern medicine perhaps it should be 85. I don't know. Allegedly, it was introduced by Paul VI because allegedly somebody voted for Cardinal del Val, who'd been dead for 30 years. And also, I think there's also a good argument that, you know, with longevity now, you might have 120 voters and 80 retired bishops, well, who are no longer involved in the day-to-day running of the church, and that would skew the pastoral priorities, the reflexes. So I think it makes sense to have a cut-off, and I'm not objecting to the 80-year age limit.
But no doubt you'll find it difficult when you turn 80 and not being able to have a vote in the conclave.
No, I won't particularly find it difficult. It's one less responsibility.
And the passage of time and heading into your 80s, how do you feel about that? Some people despise it, growing older, they fear it, they look back more, they're more nostalgic.
No, I've had a wonderful life. I've been blessed with a good family, blessed with good friends, work that I think my biggest consolation now is that whatever my imperfections and foolishness, I haven't thrown my life away on some nonsense cause, like just making money for myself. You know, that I've devoted my life to Christ, to the church, imperfectly and ineffectively, but I get some considerable consolation with that.
Any regrets in life, in general?
No, not many. I'm not one to go back looking over things. One mistake I think I did make media-wise was not to project myself in a way that showed that I was human. Like people would want to do human interest stories on me in the media, and I always refused because I said, no, I'm here to preach and to teach. I'm not here to increase the cult of personality. But if I had allowed myself to be seen as somebody who didn't always
just speak out on controversial issues, and
didn't always have two horns, and was totally unsympathetic, in that it might have helped the reception of my message.
Because you were always a polarizing figure in Australia, because you spoke your mind, you didn't mind speaking out about topics of the day.
No, it's not my mind. That's, I mean,
well, your beliefs, what you believed in.
Not even so much what I believed in. I mean, that might or mightn't be interesting. I might or might not say it tactfully. The really important issue for the church is, do we teach publicly what Christ taught? Now, some of those teachings are quite unpopular. Forgiveness, people with no rights like the unborn, people at the bottom of the pile. As a church leader, should you speak up on issues where you know you're not going to get the popular vote, where you know most of the people are against you. Basically, we have an obligation to keep presenting the teachings of Christ and the teachings of the Catholic Church. And our society will be deeply diminished to the extent it moves radically away from the Christian teachings on love and service and forgiveness. And we can already see that in society, in the changes that are taking place. We're often concentrating on the losses to the church of a decline of practice and the departure of believers. That's certainly true, but it has big consequences for society generally, especially when a majority of the people had been Christian.
Your Eminence, Cardinal George Pell, it was great to talk with you once again, and thank you very much for your time.
Good, thank you.